After the boar, you would think Eurystheus might have run out of ways to humiliate Heracles. He had already sent him against teeth, venom, antlers, mountains, and deathless pain. But the fifth labor was different. No monster, no chase, no glorious battle, just a smell that could ruin a kingdom. Eurystheus gave the command from the safety of his palace, and quite possibly from near his favorite bronze jar. "Go to Elis," he said, "find the stables of King Augeas, clean them in a single day." This was not a chore, it was an insult dressed as an assignment. Heroes fought beasts, kings made treaties, slaves mucked out stalls. Eurystheus was not trying to test Heracles' strength, he was trying to drag the strongest man alive down into the dirt. And Augeas was the perfect man for it. Ancient sources disagree on his father. Some make him a son of the sun god Helios, some of Poseidon, some of a mortal king. Everyone agrees on the important part: he was rich, absurdly rich. His cattle were famous across Greece. The herd was so huge, and the neglect so complete, that the cattle yard had not been properly cleaned in 30 years. 30 years of animals packed behind walls, 30 years of waste rising in layers. By the time Heracles arrived, the place was not dirty, it was geological. Picture the scene: Heracles, still wearing the lion he killed with his bare hands, standing before a task that no club could solve. You cannot strangle a stable. You cannot shoot an odor with hydra poison. For once, brute force was almost useless. So he did something people forget Heracles could do. He thought. Before he lifted a shovel, before he touched a wall, he went to Augeas himself and made a bargain. "If I clean this in one day," Heracles said, "give me 1/10 of your cattle." Augeas looked at the yard, looked at the man in the lion skin, and saw free labor wearing confidence as a costume. 1/10 of the herd was a fortune, but if the job was impossible, the promise cost him nothing, so he agreed. There was one problem for Augeas. His son Phyleus heard the bargain. Phyleus was young, but not foolish. He knew what his father had promised. In a story full of kings hiding in jars and kings lying in daylight, that detail matters. Now, if this story has reached you as a children's version, you probably imagine Heracles cleaning with superhuman speed. A shovel in each hand, mountains of filth flying through the air. That is not the best version. The best version is stranger, smarter, and much funnier. Near the cattle yard ran two rivers, the Alpheus and the Peneus. They were not weapons, they were not monsters. They were simply water moving with the patience of the world. Heracles looked from the rivers to the walls, and the labor changed shape in his mind. Here is the key: Heracles does not really clean the stable. He redesigns the landscape until the landscape cleans it for him. That is why this labor matters. It is the one where the strongest man in Greece wins by refusing to use strength the obvious way. He went to the riverbanks and began to work. Stones came loose, earthworks opened, channels were cut. The rivers that had spent their lives minding their own business suddenly found new paths waiting for them. Then he broke openings into the walls of the cattle yard. One gap for the water to enter, one gap for it to leave, not a door, a wound in the old neglect. The filth of 30 years was about to meet a force that did not get tired. When the diverted rivers came through, the whole estate must have heard it. Not the scrape of shovels, not the groan of workers. A raw, clean water thundered into the cattle yard and began tearing 30 years of shame out by the roots. This is Heracles at his most underrated. He did not overpower the task, he changed the terms of it. Eurystheus gave him degradation. Augeas gave him a rigged bargain. Heracles answered with civil engineering, which is less glamorous than strangling a lion, but frankly, more useful before lunch. By sunset, the impossible was done. The yard that had been a monument to neglect stood, washed open to the light. The smell was gone, the filth was gone. The king's wealth had been cleaned by the rivers he had never thought to use. Augeas, however, had stopped finding the bargain amusing. 1/10 of his cattle was no longer a joke. It was a bill, and rich men who think a promise is impossible often become very legalistic when the impossible walks back in to collect. Then Augeas learned the job had been ordered by Eurystheus. That gave him the excuse he wanted. If Heracles was already bound to do the labor, Augeas argued, then the bargain did not count. The king had promised payment when he thought he was hiring a man. Now he pretended he had been tricked. So the dispute went before judges, not over whether the stable was clean. Everyone could smell the answer to that. The question was narrower and uglier. Had Augeas promised payment before he knew the labor belonged to Eurystheus? Phyleus was called. The son of Augeas stood before the judges and did the thing myths rarely reward in the moment. He told the truth. Yes, his father had promised the cattle. Yes, Heracles had done exactly what he said he would do. Augeas could have paid. He could have swallowed the loss, cursed the hero, and kept his son. Instead, he chose pride. He drove Heracles out of Elis. And because Phyleus had testified against him, he drove out his own son as well. That is one of the small human tragedies inside this labor. Phyleus does the right thing and loses his home for it, not to a monster, not to Hera's rage, to a father who would rather break his household than admit he owed a debt. Heracles returned to Eurystheus with the job complete. One day, 30 years of filth gone, a royal estate transformed. Even for Heracles, it was a spectacular answer to an insulting command. And Eurystheus refused to count it. According to Apollodorus, this was one of the labors he erased. Why? Because Heracles had asked to be paid. A labor done for profit, Eurystheus claimed, was not a labor done in service. This is how the famous 12 labors become more than 12. The Hydra did not count because Iolaus helped. The stables did not count because Heracles sought a wage. 2 victories erased by the smallest man in the story. But Eurystheus' verdict misses the point. The 5th labor proves something no lion or boar could prove. Heracles is not only strong, he can adapt. He can think around a problem. He can turn humiliation into architecture. And Augeas is not finished with the story. Heracles will remember the insult. Later, after the labors, he comes back to Elis with an army. In some traditions, the crooked king pays for that broken promise with his throne. So yes, this is the stable cleaning labor. It is also a story about contracts, witnesses, bad faith, and the kind of man who thinks power means never having to honor a bargain. Mythology, as usual, has invented paperwork and made it personal. Heracles cleaned the uncleanable. Augeas refused to pay. Phyleus told the truth. Eurystheus refused to count the victory. By the end, the stables were spotless, and everyone around Heracles looked dirtier than before. The next labor would leave the filth behind and send Heracles into a nightmare of wings. In the marshes of Stymphalian, bronze-beaked birds darkened the sky, their feathers falling like weapons. And this time, strength would not be enough either. Follow the story. Heracles is only getting started.